Hi everyone, welcome to ArtsFest Online. Today we will be joining Dr Louise Fenton as she examines the history and story behind the Witchcraft poppet. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the talk. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Claire, for hosting this. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If you've not attended one before, just to let you know, I can't see you at all. So if you're having a cup of coffee or you're relaxing in your slippers, it's fine. I can't see you. I know you're out there, but you can see me. I can't see you. I'd like to just say a quick thank you to Simon and Fergus from the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. Obviously, we're in lockdown. I couldn't go and get documents I needed. So huge thank you to them for getting documents up to me as quickly as I needed to. So my name is Louise Fenton. I'm a senior lecturer in contextual studies at the School of Art in Wolverhampton at the University of Wolverhampton. This is one of a series of talks I've been given about my research. My background is in illustration. However, my more recent work has been in the visual and material culture of voodoo, witchcraft and the occult. My PhD was on the representations of voodoo, the influence and history of Haitian voodoo, and that's how this led in. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Just a little bit about the talk. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview so you understand the context for this poppet, and then I'm going to give you the history and the story of one of my favourite objects in the museum at the moment. It changes all the time, but she stayed with me for a long time. In 1736, Parliament passed. Oh, bear with me, I've already made a mistake. Let me just share my screen with you. I'm carrying on regardless. There we go. Okay. Oh, I should mention, if any of you have a question afterwards and you don't feel you can ask it in the chat room, please do feel free to email me after the event. I'm more than happy to answer emails. My email address is now on the screen. It's louise.fenton@wlv.ac.uk. So please feel free to contact me. So to start the talk, in 1736, Parliament passed an act to repeal the laws against witchcraft, but they imposed fines or imprisonment on people who were deemed to be able to use magical practices or have magical powers. 1951 is often cited as the date that the Witchcraft Act was repealed. However, it was repealed but replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act, and that was in turn not repealed until 2008. So most of this is fairly recent, but those dates are quite important and significant, especially the 1951. So I became interested, bear with me one moment. I became interested and involved with the museum back in 2010. My PhD was completed then, which, as I said, was on the representations of voodoo and vodou. And as most people will think, voodoo, pins and dolls, it's the first thing that most people think about. However, that's linked to witchcraft rather than voodoo. And on completion of my PhD, somebody said to me, oh, you must go down to Boscastle. There's this amazing collection of poppets, these little dolls with pins in, it'd be right up your street. So off I went. And that's where it all began. And this is a picture of the museum. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. It's in Boscastle, Cornwall. It is closed this season because of COVID, but next year I'm sure they will be opening their doors and welcoming us all again. So inside the museum, there is a cabinet of curses, and this is where my work really started. It's a collection of dolls that are made from lots of materials. So there's wax, there's paper, they're knitted, they're sewn. There are clippings, there are objects such as the gloves, and all of these are designed to curse. Some dolls are made to heal, but my work is mainly around the curses. These are amazing artifacts, but they're created with an intent. 3 years ago, I curated an exhibition at the museum where I brought all the cursed objects together. And it was such a privilege to handle them. I know this is a bit of an aside, but it was such a privilege to handle them and to actually feel what they're made of, how they're made, but with bearing in mind all the time that there was an intent to harm. And although I'm interested in the material and visual culture of these dolls, what really you need to appreciate is the context of them, the history of them, and that's why I began to look at the social history. this is the doll I'm talking about today. I call her the Bavarian doll. She's referred to as the doll in the black lace dress, the doll with the dagger through her face, but this is her story. So this is the one I'm talking about today. The story revolves around Mr. Cecil Hugh Williamson, the founder of the Museum of Witchcraft. He himself has a fascinating story and was a very colourful character. Unfortunately, I didn't personally know him. I've watched hours of footage of him. I've spoken to people who did, and I wish I had. I've been writing his story for many years, which hopefully will come to fruition before too long, but he has such a fascinating career. But according to his records, he took part in over 1,000 rituals. So in some places and some articles you might read about him, he denies any involvement in witchcraft, but I did find records that he took part in all of these rituals. A brief timeline of Cecil, just to give a bit of context to what I'm going to talk about. He had a career in the film industry. He's cited as a director in 1930s. In 1938, he formed the Witchcraft Research Centre, which was linked to MI6, dealing with the occult and the Nazis, and that will be mentioned later. In 1946, he met Gerald Gardner. 51, he founded the Witch's Kitchen and the Witch's Mill on the Isle of Man, and Gerald Gardner was the resident witch. In 54, he relocates to Bourton-on-the-Water. And then in 1960, he opens the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, and that's where it's been to this day. It celebrates, obviously, an anniversary this year, and then next year is 70 years since it was originally founded in 51. But those are dates that bear in mind as we go through the talk. So these are images of the Witch's Mill, which was in Castletown on the Isle of Man. The museum no longer exists there, obviously he moved it. The tower is still evident. If you go to Castletown on the Isle of Man, you will see this tower. It's quite iconic, but it's now totally surrounded by luxury apartments. So if you do want to see it, you can, but you can't go in because it's private housing now. But you can see it was quite an iconic building. It really sparked curiosity. This is 1951, people are starting to become interested. It would have been a little bit of a taboo subject, an unusual museum, and so it wasn't surprising that the press became involved. So in 1952, Illustrated magazine contacted Cecil Williamson and asked to do an article about him, about witchcraft in Britain, and about the Isle of Man Museum. And this is when Cecil Williamson met a photographer who did the article. She was the photographer for the article, called Juliette Lazare. The article was published on the 27th of September 1952. It ran over several pages, and it included images of Cecil making a poppet or a doll, as you can see in the images. I've got a close-up of a couple of them. So in one, he's bathing the head. The one on the right, the straw into the doll's mouth is either to breathe life into it or to suck life out of it. I'm not sure which he's doing there. But from his directorial background, I've found several sketches. So he actually planned this and orchestrated it quite well for the magazine. He was in control of what went into this article, but Juliette did all the photographs. He kept in contact with Juliette, and there was a discussion of further articles of her meeting his family. She talked about meeting his lovely wife and his daughters. So they had quite a good relationship. And then in 1953, this letter appeared, and this was in April 1953. She talks about, she opens it quite as you would. Dear Mr. Williamson, quite formal at this point. Since months I wanted to write to you asking how you and Mrs. Williamson are, and what about a new story. They wanted to, obviously, Witchcraft sold very well, and they wanted to look at what else they could publish. How are things at the Witch's Kitchen, and what kind of plans do you have? I always hoped that you and your wife would have been coming to London, making it possible for me to have met again. Then she goes on, there are many things to discuss. I would like your advice for a special case concerning friends of mine. And this is the first indication we have that she had something to ask him. Now I'm going to read from a letter that followed, It's too much to put on the screen, and it would be too hard for reading. But she sent in May 1953, so a month after this, she set the seed about asking advice. Then she writes that there are two delightful people I know, good-hearted, helpful, intelligent, wishing no one any harm. In 1946, they had to take a refugee in their house, an obligation as they had 2 rooms more than they needed, and because of the shortage of accommodation, they had to accept it. We tried to help, as they were 2 of the rare people who really had nothing to do with Nazism, but nothing doing. In one room lives a couple, quite nice, and no worries with them. In the other came an elderly, in inverted commas, lady. She calls herself so-and-so, lived in the best circles of Berlin. Husband was certainly a Nazi. He was professor and lectured in Prague when the Nazis occupied the country. He disappeared after the war and she's not seen him again. This person, I've seen her and I know quite a lot about her, is the most unpleasant character, and it is hell to have her in the house. She does everything to annoy my friends, and she gets her own way in everything. My friends tried to get rid of her, but she has very high connections in the Ministry for Refugees in Munich. Then a court case which my friends lost, even though they had all the proof and right on their side, and so it goes on. Since this person is in the house, my friends are unlucky, and I am sure that she is a kind of evil spirit. My friends, much too noble in their attitude, can't cope with her and are more and more depressed. Some months ago, one of the 2 sisters slipped out in the kitchen and broke her thigh bone. It happened for no apparent reason, an unfortunate accident perhaps. So now, after having spent weeks and weeks in a hospital, she's back at home and just starts to walk again, but it will take a long time until she will be completely healed. When I saw them last summer, I told them about you, and I wanted for a long time already to write to you and ask your advice. Because having made your acquaintance and being willing to believe that the other person is in a way a kind of bad spirit, I am sure and more sure that you could do something. I consider you more as a friend than just somebody I met through my work. And after receiving your letter, it seems to me as if I could ask you in a much easier way. Please think about this story and tell me frankly what you propose and how one could take the spell away from such very good and nice people. Strangely enough, my friends allowed me to write to you because they think too that the lady is full of evil power, which brings them nothing but unpleasantness. And before she entered the house, everything went well and smoothly. So there are the first facts. And again, I ask you to take it very seriously. Don't think that I want to see what you can or cannot do. I myself am very confident of help from you. So that sets the scene of where she was coming from and the friend she had. Shortly after this, she writes again. So the following month, so we've had a letter in April, May and June. Again, she starts off asking what he did to celebrate Coronation Day. Has he had a good time? Then she says, I got an answer from my friends in Bavaria. As I'm going to see them fairly soon, I will bring the poppet with me, as it is not easy to send it before. They are very grateful and asked me to express their thanks for your help. It seems to be more and more difficult with that person. I do hope that you can help them later. So she's asked month after month for Cecil's help. There were some other letters between them. Cecil apparently does reply, and he asks them to make the poppet and to use clothing from the wardrobe, to try and get hair from the victim that needs to be got rid of or spell lifted from. So although a lot of these, they're little snippets, this is how I started to piece the story together. Juliet then says that it's very difficult to send out because of customs regulations. This is 1953, and she was a bit concerned. And also Cecil had asked them to supply a weapon, either from themselves or from friends of theirs who are in sympathy with them. So to send a weapon and a poppet through the post and get it through customs was probably a little bit unlikely, to say the least. So she writes to him to say that she will collect the poppet and the weapon and bring it via Switzerland, Germany in July or August. So Bavaria I've highlighted on the left, that's the area of Germany it sits in. So you can see Munich, and it's just above Austria. Austria at this time was under Russian rule, which also features in the story. And then on the other side, I've done the map of Europe. So you can see Germany in the blue, and she would have gone via Switzerland. I don't believe she went through Germany. It looks as if she went up through France and then back to the UK. So that was the journey of the poppet. We're now into September 1953, and she states that when she can hand the poppet over, because she said, by the way, I brought you the poppet in question plus the other thing necessary, which is the stiletto dagger. I would like you to have these as soon as possible, as the matter is now very urgent, but feel it would be better to give them to you personally rather than send them. After this particular letter, the correspondence between them seems to start to fail a little bit. There is a letter that she asks again in, I think it's early 1954. I know he got the doll by then, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's a letter saying, why aren't you answering me? Why is our friendship dissolved? I thought we were friends. But at the same time, we've got to remember that in 52, his relationship with Gerald Gardner had broken down, and he sold the museum on the Isle of Man. He moved it to Windsor, then he moved it to Bourton on the Water in 1954. So all of that was going on in his life. We know he made the poppet, which I'll show you in a moment, but we don't know why he stopped communication with Juliet. So this is the doll. This is how she would have looked in 1953 when she was made. This photograph was taken in the mid to late 1950s. As you can tell by the buildings in the background, it's likely to be when the museum was in Bourton on the Water. It looks very Cotswold. But she's finely dressed. We know he's got the doll. Whether he'd done the spell, I'm suspecting he had, because the dagger's through the face. But she's dressed in this fine lace dress. She's got a lovely hat on. Her hair is very dark. It's hard to tell if the hair is actually human or not. It has faded over time, but the features are quite sharp. It's believed to represent the person it's supposed to be attacking. So this should be representing the Nazi wife. But as I said, we know it was with him in 1954. She remained with Cecil and the museum from this point forward. These are two photographs of her in the cabinet. She's still with the museum in Cornwall now. The one on the left, you can see her hair is starting to fade, but her features are still quite strong. But the one on the right, she's lying down and her hair has faded now and her dress is looking a little bit shabby. But I'd like to bring your attention to the image on the left. Those blocks of text are Cecil's captions. He did like his captions. He wrote, if you could say something in 5 words, Cecil would say it in 3 pages. He really liked to write. So what's fortunate, we've got lots and lots of information about this particular doll. But you can see how she's faded. I'm afraid to tell you that we don't know if this worked or not. Excuse me. We don't know. So the mystery still remains. There is still that air of mystery around this. I haven't stopped searching. I'm still trying to find Juliet. I'm still trying to resolve a few issues around the doll. The story never ends with any of these. With any research, it never comes to an end. But we don't know whether these sisters were saved from this woman. I do know that Juliet moved to Germany and she lived there from about 1956, but then the whole trail dries up. But going back to the labels and how I managed to piece the story together. So I'd found these letters, I found the photographs, so I'd got photographs and letters, but the captions were a bit more evasive. When I first visited the museum, I was presented with a whole mountain of folders with captions in. There must have been thousands, and I literally had to sift. Thankfully, they're all being filed and digitized now, but 10 years ago, I was sifting through them, and I managed to find 4 relating to this particular doll, and they tell a bit of a story on them by themselves. So the material and hair used in making this image came from the victim. This doll came to the Witchcraft Research Centre from a woman in Russian occupied Austria. Need one say more? So if you think back to the map, at the time from 1945 to 1955, Russia did occupy Austria, and that was right on the border with Bavaria. So there's a kind of element of truth in there. The Witchcraft Research Centre, as I said, was founded in 1938. It carried on at the museum, so he's saying that's where it went. That's why it came there. The next caption I found was the hair and lace dress material came from the intended victim, which this doll represents. The spell worked in Russian occupied Austria. So again, it's that link to very close to the Bavarian border, but not saying it was in Bavaria and Germany. It's saying that it was in Russian occupied Austria. Third caption, this doll image is dressed in a gown fashioned from stolen material from the victim's wardrobe. The stiletto driven with force through the poppet's face and eye played a major part in the long-fought quarrel. A story which everyone involved was a loser. Exmouth, 1909-1913. Now, what I have found with Cecil, he was prolific with his letters, with his writings, with his notebooks, and his text for captions and cards for his exhibitions. But whenever a place is in capital letters on one of these captions, it generally isn't the place it's referring to. So it was almost a code, remembering that Cecil was linked to MI6, whether that's got anything to do with it. But he tended to do a capitalised place when he was trying to hide a place. The dates, 1909-1913. I know this is the doll, as you can see from the image dressed in a gown fashioned from stolen material. It ties in with the letters, it ties in with the descriptions. The stiletto driven with force through the poppet's face, again, ties with this doll. So it all links together. But we know she was made in 1953. So if there's anybody out there who is good at decoding or has any ideas, I'd be happy to listen. But the dates he's put are 1909, 1913, and we know it was 1953. There are no code breaking notebooks, so we don't know what his method was, but we do know capitalised Exmouth, it wasn't in Exmouth, and we know those dates aren't true because it was 1953. Interestingly, at the end of that caption, it says a story which everyone involved was a loser. So the implication there is that it didn't end happily for anybody. Oh, I have a slight, there we go. And finally, this caption I found, which is his longest one. This is one of the longest I could find, but it does give a bit more description. So to generate deep hate within a person is a most dangerous thing to do. And many practitioners will say to you, you know, if you want to wish harm, you should think very carefully about it. It's not something to do lightly. It's a very dangerous thing to do. For everyone, once in a while, one of those to whom hardship and suffering has been caused will strike back. So it was with this well-to-do lady, again, that links to what the letter said, who unfortunately had a mean and spiteful nature. The doll image is created and dressed in a gown fashioned from stolen material from out of the victim's wardrobe. The stiletto, and he wrote that in capital letters, driven with force through the poppet's face and eye, played a major part in the long-fought quarrel. It too was taken by stealth from the Exmouth home of the victim, and we know it was taken by stealth from Bavaria and Germany through Europe. But whether Exmouth stands for Europe, we don't know. I can't find any code, but he uses Exmouth again here. An involved story which, when all was said and done, like a Greek tragedy, everyone involved in the end was the loser. Period 1909-1913. So there is some correlation between the different texts, albeit loosely, but I hope you can see this is months and months of work to piece these together, but finding these captions, then finding the letters, finding the photographs of the doll, it all started to come together, and it's quite rewarding when it does all piece together in the end. Bavaria, just talking about Bavaria, why would the Nazis be there? It was actually Hitler's power base in the 1920s. So it held, Munich was the centre of Bavaria, and they had this refugee system. So that's how the wife ended up in the rooms. So the labels do give us a clue, but Cecil was notorious for embellishing and elaborating on fact. But he was also very sensitive to people who approached him for help. So he did protect their identities as well, and the locations. So it's a bit of both, really. This is how she looks in the cabinet. She's now 67 years old this year. So she's aging. She has lasted well. She's hand sewn. And as I said, 67 years, has travelled from place to place, but she still survives. And as these photos show, this is how she's aged. The image on the left, she's got her beautiful little cape on, her gown, her hair is jet black, her hat is neatly folded, her features are very sharp. But over time, her hair has faded to this very pale sandy colour. Her dress has deteriorated, her features are less defined, but she still packs an impact when you see her with that dagger through her face. So I would strongly recommend that you do go and see her. As I said, the museum is closed this season, but please do go and visit the doll, have a look at her, and have a look at the amazing collection that they have. It's well worth a visit, beautiful part of the world. I do hope that you've enjoyed her story. It's been quite an investigation. It's taken me over a decade so far, and it's still not showing any sign of ending. She keeps me fascinated, but the reward is always putting these pieces together and bringing history to life. So I thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions, and I hope you found it as interesting as I do. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. We do have some questions. So we've got one here from Fiona Sanderson. She says, a dagger through the face seems partic violent. Is that usually where a poppet would be pierced, or does that indicate an extremity of intent, perhaps?
I think it was the extremity of intent. I mean, the poppets I've worked with, they tend to be, it can be the head, it can be the stomach. It depends what kind of harm is wished, but it can be, if you think about the dolls are made, well, the objects, because there are all sorts of objects, they're made with the intent to harm. So the intent is coming from the person who's making it, the materials that are being used to make it. And then, yes, I think the dagger through the face is particularly violent, but perhaps it was felt that this was needed in this case. Many dolls I've worked with, it's pins in the abdomen or in the head, some around the throat. I've seen dolls with shards of glass embedded in their stomachs, in the wax ones. So it can vary. Some are burned. The museum has some of the objects which are photographs, which have pins in them and then are burned. So there's many ways. And I mean, you could argue that they're all quite violent in their own way. But what's interesting with the collection at the Witchcraft Museum is that many of these objects don't survive. They have a purpose, and a lot of them are either burned as part of the ritual, or buried, or destroyed because people are either frightened of them or as part of the ritualistic practice. So we're very fortunate that there are some in existence that have a story, that we have actually archival material to give them an identity and a reason and a purpose. But yes, I totally agree. I think this one was particularly violent for the woman concerned.
Yeah. Well, when you said that you were able to pick them up and to touch all these objects, did you feel there was some kind of transference of some
I don't think kind of, am I scared when I do this work?
Just some kind of feeling or a
I would say,
or something from the object.
I've never felt it until I did the exhibition and we moved all of the curses in one room together. So this room was just boxes of objects which have been delicately placed. And you have to be respectful, whether you believe in witchcraft, whether you believe that people can be cursed or not. These objects were made with the intent to harm. So that whoever made them, their whole intent was driven by hatred, by fear, by persecution. They were made to harm. And so you had to have a real respect. What was interesting, and I remain objective, I put all the things together. I felt violently sick for 3 or 4 times. I sat with them. I had to leave the building, come back in, go out, go in. And then I just sat down and I explained, I actually sat and spoke to all these objects and explained what I was doing. And it seemed to calm, whether it calmed me, which it did, or it calmed them, I don't know. But after that, I felt totally at ease with them. And it felt wonderful to actually, I mean, I was very respectful. And I held them, and we did, you know, somebody did come in and put protection charms around the exhibition so that, but interestingly, people were very concerned, not the museum director, I have to say, he was so supportive. Simon has been fabulous with my work, but there were others who were saying, well, you know, we might get criticism, aren't you worried that there'll be a backlash? But the only controversial question I had or statement was that somebody felt a little bit overwhelmed when they walked in the room. They felt it was a little bit overwhelming to be in a room with so many cursed objects.
Oh, that's
people are fascinated. It's, you know, it's part of our cultural history. This is part of our society. Once the repeal of the Witchcraft Act happened in 51, lots of these objects were made, and it was almost as if it gave permission for people to, I don't want to say dabble, but some of the objects were made by not practitioners, but just general public.
Oh, it's quite creepy, isn't it?
Beautiful, you know. Yes, they're creepy, and yes, they were made to harm, but as well, I mean, there are beautifully knitted dolls which are quite horrendous because they're you know, there's a hanging doll, one that's been hanged, some are burned, but then you find 2 rocks in a bin liner that was a death curse. So, you know, again, I say it's this intent, it's what was the intent for the object, more so than what the object is.
That's interesting. Okay, next question.
From
New to 3979. In his text, did Cecil ever make reference to the 3-fold rule regarding any bad intention coming back to the practitioner 3 times as hard?
This rule is often cited. Yes, I have seen him make comment to it, but he talks more about, you know, if you do evil things, you should expect evil back. And some of you might know that if you don't know the 3-fold rule in Voodoo, they always say, so I'm holding my hand up now so you can see, but if you point 1 finger, you've got 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. So in effect, if you're doing harm, you've got it coming back 3 times over. And yes, he does. He talks a lot about, you know, with poppets, and there's a really good quote from him, with poppets and pins, we do evil things. So he's fully aware that it's being used for evil, but you should do it with caution. And as he said in that quote, to generate deep hate within a person is a dangerous thing to do for everyone concerned, because every once in a while somebody will snap. And then...
Wow, okay. Next one. We've got quite a lot here to get through, Louise. This one's from Cast Iron. Has there been any analysis on the hair to see if it is human? It's fascinating.
No, and that is my question. If I don't know if Simon's listening tonight, if he's not, I will be on the phone to him tomorrow to ask if we can have an analysis, because it's the one thing. Simon Costin is the director of the museum now. He took over a few years ago. And this was so, obviously I started working on this doll before his time, and there was never any sort of scientific support, but we work with I work with other universities, and I think we need to do that, because I would love to know if it was her hair, or, I mean, it's faded over time. Maybe it was, maybe it's aged with the doll, which I find creepy in itself, that the hair has gone from jet black to this very pale sandy colour. But yes, it needs to be done, and it will be done before my book's published, because it's got to be in there.
Well, it kind of, that answers Julie's question. I think she's asked if You think that the hair may have been manipulated to make it look more human?
It may have been manipulated, but the hair is the original hair, so it has faded with the doll. But like I said, she's 67 years old. The dress has faded somewhat. It's jet black in early photos. It's now a kind of pale grey and very fragile with bits falling off it. So it's not handled too much because it's so frail now.
Okay, next question. This is from Anonymous. During your research journey, how did you decide that the potential benefits of this investigation outweighed the potential detriments of becoming so invested and absorbed in this side of the occult?
Okay, first of all, I would say that I'm an objective observer. I work with witchcraft, I work with practitioners of witchcraft, I work with voodoo priests and priestesses. I'm not a practitioner. I have my own beliefs. I have, I think we've all got some superstition. I have to stay objective because it would be very difficult if I was too invested in any of these. It would be very difficult for me to write objectively about them and to visit ceremonies and do the work I do. I didn't really make a conscious decision to go into this investigation. It's really weird to say this, but I got drawn in. I really did get drawn in. I went to the Museum of Witchcraft and met Graham King in 2010, and he showed me the cabinet. He said, well, nobody's really looked at these. And it was almost as if just, something in me said, well, I will. I'm fascinated. Why were these made? I didn't know anything about them. And it's not the only aspect of my work. I hasten to add, I don't just look at curses. That's one aspect of my work, because I'm very interested in representations of these things. I'm interested in how cinema's manipulated our understanding. So, sorry, that's a very long answer to, I didn't make a conscious decision. I didn't really weigh up whether one thing outweighed the other. I'm very cautious when I get involved with this kind of work, and I take advice. But I think it's important we understand the social history of these objects. They're part of our cultural history and they're part of society.
So, just on the back of that, actually, this one fits in quite well. Are poppets sometimes used for good and well-wishing in any way?
Absolutely. And there's a wax poppet in the collection, which is from a mould, and it's got a hole in its back, and it's got, although you'll see it in a coffin, and people think automatically it's for cursing, they used and put herbs in the back. In voodoo, dolls are used for channeling positive energy. Poppets are used very much for healing as much as they are for harm. It just happens that my interest was in the cursing and what drove people to do that aspect and how were they made.
This one is from Natalie Nicole. She says, it is rare to have such a well pieced together story around such an artefact, or are there other instances like this?
Yes, I have a book coming out. Not to be totally selfish here. I've done a lot of work, and the archives at the museum provide us with quite a story. I'm also working with dolls up at Greyfriars Kirkyard in Scotland. They've got a collection of haunted and affected dolls. So there are other instances like this. I've given a couple of talks before about other curses that I've worked on. I've just had an article published in the Inquiring Eye, if you're interested, about two poppets made to curse out of putty. So that's just been published if you want to have a look at that. But yeah, there are other instances. The museum is a central focus for my work because they have the archives. Other than that, it's unusual to have this. Like I said, a lot of dolls are just destroyed, so you don't get this pieced together story. But it's not easy. It takes a lot of time, and you've got to read between the lines and make sure it does match up, because it's very easy to go down a wrong thread.
Okay, this one from Sarah Jackson. Fascinating talk, thank you. What is the most recently created poppet you've seen and the oldest? I mean, I think you may have sort of just touched on that.
The newest one, I mean, they're still being made all the time. If I had a doll, I say a voodoo doll rather than a poppet, made for me 2 years ago. The most recently created cursing poppet I've seen was in 2017, and that was left for 2 lecturers in Bournemouth University, and it was quite horrendous. One was a Barbie doll with her eyes gouged out and pins in it, and the other one was a teddy bear, which was somehow even creepier. So those are the most recent created harmful poppets. The oldest one I've seen, you could argue, I mean, there are descriptions in all the witch trials, but the oldest one I've physically actually seen for real is probably 1750s. I've got 2 little dolls from Peru of my own. They were for healing, not for harm. And they're probably the oldest and I own them, so that's quite nice.
Okay. Are you making art? Sorry, this is from Jay Orange. Are you making art based on your research?
Yes, as I said, I'm an illustrator and an artist, and I've kept the 2 very separate for a long time. But thanks to a friend of mine who is my line manager at work, she's sort of encouraged me to start bringing the 2 together. So yes, I have started now making art based on your research, and I will start posting on Instagram and Twitter, and hopefully have an exhibition next year.
Yes, that would be fantastic. This one's from Anonymous. Thank you for a great webinar. What documentation remains on the history of witchcraft, particularly in Europe? And separately, what are your thoughts on the Voynich manuscript?
Right, okay. It depends what dates you're looking at. History of witchcraft pamphlets are still available. You can, I think in the British Library, there's still access to many of them. They are available to buy online. You can get DVDs as reproductions of the old pamphlets. So we do have History of Witchcraft. There are so many publications. Again, I would push anyone that's interested to go approach the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle. They have the only unsolicited occult library in Europe, I believe. It's unsolicited in that the books in there are, a lot of them would have been banned, they would have been questionable, but for History of Witchcraft, that's your place to go. It's got everything you could possibly want to know. And I'm not familiar with the Voynich manuscript, so that's something I need to look at.
Okay. Thanks for that. Jan Hart says, I had the privilege of seeing your exhibition in 2017 and it was fantastic. I would like to say you're very brave in handling these poppets.
I think I thought so too at the time, but once I started, privileged once I got going.
Okay, this one is from U23979. Do you think it is relevant that the word stiletto in the second text is in capitals and Exmouth isn't this time?
Yeah, that was quite interesting. I don't know which way around those 2 captions. So the one where Exmouth is in capitals, whether that was a later caption, I can't date those. They were just all thrown together in boxes. So I do know Exmouth, we know it's not the place, but the word stiletto, yes, that is interesting. It's in capitals. That has been the same knife that's been thrust through her face since she was created. I did find one photograph where the actual dagger looked completely different, but it went back to what it was. So whether Cecil used it for some other means, I don't know. If it was in capitals to hide something, that one I'm not, because he only seemed to use capitals to shield a place rather than other things. But I don't know why that particular word was in capitals. Maybe just to impact, with more impact.
Yeah, it certainly did that.
Yes.
Okay, this one's from Deborah Curitan. Do you think that the force of intent was to do with the association to the war and the belief that the lady that it was intended to harm was believed to be linked to the Nazis?
Absolutely. And Cecil was heavily involved with anti-Nazi propaganda. He was linked to MI6. He was linked to quite a few rituals that were supposed to have taken place. Then the Nazis are renowned for their belief in occult. And it's believed they did some scoping exercises in the UK, and he was involved in setting up some fake rituals in woodlands that they knew they were coming into, and sending out propaganda. So he would have been very, very strong, had very strong feelings about this. So absolutely, I'm absolutely convinced that the fact she was linked to Nazism was part of the force of intent.
Okay, sorry, there's just loads of questions coming in.
Sure.
This one is from Fiona Sanderson. She says, do you know the earliest times that these were made?
Dolls have been made for millennia.
You kind of touched on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are dolls, I think, you know, even in ancient Egypt, there were image magic has always existed. Where civilizations have existed, image magic has existed. The term poppet is more recent. It starts to be coined in, I think, the 17th century. I'm sure there are witch historians who will correct me on that, but I'm sure it's the 17th century we start to see the word used more frequently.
Okay, Lucy Andrew, she says, are there any other examples of poppets that you have come across where you've been able to piece together part of their history?
Yes, I've now done, I think there are 12 now that I've pieced together in the same way. That one was probably the most exciting. There are some that are a little bit more scandalous. There are some that are quite sinister. But yeah, I think I've gotten, I think there's at least 12 now. And I'm working on a few of the Greyfriars Kirkyard dolls at the moment, because some of those are, we think, late 18th, early 19th century.
Okay. Stella Wisdom asks, were the Curses exhibition where you moved the objects that we were talking about earlier on, was that at Boscastle Museum?
Yes, it was. Yes, sorry. Yeah, that in 2017, it was called Poppets, Pins and Power. You can still see photos online, but it was all about the craft of cursing. And then, of course, Oxford Ashmolean did Spellbound, and this particular doll then featured in the Spellbound exhibition at the Ashmolean as well. So she's had a couple of trips out this year.
Okay, this one's from Claire Wasserman. Were dolls ever made to increase somebody's health and well-being?
Yes, they were. Yeah, as I said, in voodoo practice, they're often to channel positive and healing. Even in witchcraft, there's a lot more healing with dolls, especially wax dolls with holes in the back, dolls packed with herbs. So yes, they are. And I mean, I've come across a lot of little rag dolls that are carried, and the same as the mojo bags and juju bags and gree bags in New Orleans.
This one from Tom Hicks. This activity is fairly recent in terms of history. Is the use of dolls still common practice, or has it moved into other forms perhaps?
Yeah, it's interesting. When photography became very popular, photographs were used and they were burned. They were pins in them, and there are a few examples where they're burned around the edges. But it seems to go back to the dolls a lot. And I mean, you can buy the jokey ones where you get a little pack of pins and a fiddly toy of some description. But the dolls, I think it's because it's image magic, and it's to represent a human in most cases. I think the doll still is that representation of form.
Okay. Emma Virgilio, she says, does Cecil have any descendants? If so, are they also involved in witchcraft?
He does. He had daughters. They live overseas and they are very much not involved in witchcraft. They had nothing to do with their father in the later years of his life. So sadly, no. I've tried to contact them on several occasions, but yeah, I think one lives in Australia. They might both live on Australia now, but yeah, he has got daughters. But he has a wide circle of friends who still talk quite fondly of him.
Okay. Bridget, she said, what is this poppet stuffed with? And is there any significance with that? And are there different types of stuffing depending upon the intent of the poppet?
Yeah, I mean, this is just stuffed with, I don't know what material it is. It's just, you know, like you would find in soft furnishings and, you know, just that fluffy type of cotton wool. I'm sorry, I don't do fabrics. It's that just general stuffing. Most of them were just stuffed with whatever cuddly toys would have been stuffed with at the time. However, there is, for example, I found a wax poppet that's got a shard of a razor blade inserted inside it, which is quite horrific. There are objects that are stuffed with melted wax. I'm trying to think what else has been stuffed. Yeah, I mean, most of them are just stuffed and then things added. So, for example, there's one with pubic hairs in, there's one with fingernails and toenails in, there's one with hair clippings in. So they're generally just stuffed to make the shape and then things added to them.
Okay. Nikki Robinson, she says, it's a fascinating story. Where does this research go now? Are you still trying to find the rest of the story and the people involved?
This research is culminating in a book called The Cabinet of Curses for Troy Books, which I'm hoping will be complete very soon, so published before too long. And that's focusing predominantly on the dolls in the collection at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic because of all the material around it. It will incorporate the work I'm doing with Greyfriars. I am still trying to find the rest of the stories because there are 3 or 4 of the poppets that people have vanished without trace, without sounding too dramatic or melodramatic or sinister or creepy. I have got some stories where I can't find the people. They've literally vanished. And I've been on local radio stations, newspapers, trying to track people down. So I am still trying to round up the stories and the people involved.
Okay. Stella Wisdom, she says, doesn't the Warburg Institute Library have a collection too?
Yeah, I mean, there are witchcraft objects all over the country, all over the world. The big difference is because of Cecil's prolific handwriting, notebooks, description cards, and being able to trace the history of the museum from day one, so from 1951 through to today, having the full archive at my disposal. It's where I've worked for so many years. But yes, there are objects. I mean, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford has quite a few amulets and charms and curses. So do other museums all over like I said, I found this cabinet of dolls up in Greyfriars Kirkyard. So they're coming up all along, throughout my work. And I'm sure, as with the voodoo, which has kept me going for over 20 years, this will keep me going. It's only been a decade, so I'm sure there's plenty of time yet.
Okay. Stacey Sampson said, does your research interest stretch to fiction written around witchcraft historically up to current? How do you feel it relates to the factual?
Okay. It doesn't stretch. No, it does. It does stretch to fiction because I'm writing a novel based on this story. So I'm using my own research for fiction. I think there's a huge interest in witchcraft, and there has been for a few years with things like Twilight, with Vampire Chronicle. There's been so much now around where witches are featured in teen programs. Sabrina the Teenage Witch being revived. I don't think very much relates to the factual, as historically never has. But I think if you're interested and you're willing to read a bit, it's there, you can find it. So take anything that's put in front of you with a pinch of salt, with the fiction or the dramatic, and then go and find out the truth.
Okay, Julie King says, apologises for being a bit late. She says, it's really interesting. I was told I was a hedge witch once in one of my lives. Where is your exhibition next, please? And did you protect yourself after feeling sick? How they affected you?
Okay. I haven't got another exhibition coming up at the moment. I'm hoping to show my artwork next year, which is all around atmospheric landscapes and enchanted places. I didn't protect myself after feeling sick because as soon as I stepped outside, it went, and then I came back in. And the only thing I did, as I said, I just sat on the floor. I was getting so frustrated, and I just spoke to them all. I did speak to a practitioner, and she said that she'd blessed everything. She'd put protective things in place. And like I said, I think I just said it out loud that I was there to tell their story. It was a positive thing. I wasn't doing anything negative, and it seemed to subside.
Okay, one from Anonymous. I think you've already covered this off, but I'll just ask anyway. Were Cecil's family also practitioners?
No. His wife died. They got divorced anyway, but his daughters, as I said, they moved abroad and they wanted nothing to do with any of his practice to do with witchcraft.
Okay, Fiona Sanderson says, not a question but a reflection really on the potency of these objects. I made a lead curse tablet as part of an archaeology related exhibition. It was just from old sheet lead from a roof. People in the exhibition treated it with caution and wondered about it to me. And now that I have it back, it is invested with a lot of meaning because of their ideas, which means it is very difficult for me to know what to do with it.
It's really difficult. A friend of mine sent me a voodoo doll from West Africa, and it arrived and I couldn't put it on. I put it outside the boundary of my home because I didn't know the intent it was made. It was an antique, a beautiful piece. Mm-hmm. And so I donated it to the Museum of Witchcraft. I gave it to them, and it's got a place in a cabinet. It might be in storage now, I'm not sure, but it came out for the exhibition. But when I'm not sure, and people do ask me about things, and they ask me if I can lift curses and can I make curses and can I do things myself? No, I can't. And I would always refer them to somebody who knows. And if you contact the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, they might not be able to give you an instant answer, but they might know somebody who can.
Okay. Anonymous has asked, what can you tell us about children's relationships to witchcraft?
Sorry, what was that one? Was that the accurate?
What can you tell us about children's relationship to witchcraft?
Yeah, I think, again, I've got two nieces who are 7 and 8. The youngest one can't really be bothered at all. The older one is fascinated by it all. I think they still have this idea that witches fly on broomsticks. They have their literature, No Room on the Broom, I suppose, introduces a lot of children to witches. I think it will always hold a fascination because the representation of witches is the cauldron, the green face, the pointy hat, Halloween, broomsticks. And although that's not factual, it's remained in popular culture, and it's really difficult to eradicate popular culture. So I think we have to sort of just let that go, but also educate as well. So if you do know a little bit about it, try and help children understand that witches were persecuted, that they might just have been healers, they might have been midwives, they might have just known how to use nature for health and well-being, and yet they were persecuted because they were a bit different. So it's about acceptance. I think if we can teach children more about acceptance, that would be great.
Okay, this one from Mel. Fascinating. It is not possible the poppet is from Exmouth, 1090 to 1913, and Cecil made a similar one years later for Juliet, which is referred to in the letters?
No, most of the poppets, they don't date. The poppet is definitely the one that was made at that time. It's highly unlikely that there was, going through all Cecil's records, these dates are randomly put. This isn't the only object where we know an object was made in the 1950s or the 1960s and it's got a date on for 1900 or 1910. I think it was just purely protection. Cecil was very, very sensitive to protecting his sources, to the people who called on him for help. So although it would be lovely to think there were two of them, I'm quite confident there aren't.
Okay, just going back to the children's involvement, Anonymous says, sorry, that they meant historically.
Oh, if we go back historically, children's involvement with, they were the accusers in the Pendle witch trials, in the Salem witch trials. It's children who are pointing the finger and causing mass hysteria. So I think, and then there's this idea that children can be evil too, and I'm sure they can be in lots of different ways. But yeah, I think historically children have been involved in witchcraft, but as the accusers, very rarely as the accused, and yet they've done a lot of harm.
That's interesting. This one from Nadia. Do you think that authors such as Pratchett have changed the image of the witch from the green-faced hag? And is this, do you think, fueling the revival of witchcraft?
Absolutely. I think it's not just Pratchett. I think there are several different authors and television and cinema. And if you think the green-faced hag was just from The Wizard of Oz, it was purely that particular character. Is it 1932 or 1939? I can't remember the year. When The Wizard of Oz came out, the witch had never been green, and then they tinted it for that film, and that was it. That was the green witch in popular culture. That was then perpetuated through cinema, through animation. I mean, animation in prime time cartoons in the 60s. How many green-faced witches were there? You know, you could probably list them. So it's a very recent, this green hag. But yes, I do think there's been this whole revival and resurgence. There are so many forums now and groups and young girls who are getting into witchcraft who aren't really practicing the craft, but like to think, you know, it's a trendy thing to be at the moment, bizarrely.
This one from Anonymous says, what is the most accurate depiction in mainstream media you've seen to date?
Oh, good question. Wow. That's what I need to think about. I think I'm going to have to think on that, because most depictions are sensationalized, because they're in horror film, or they're in the witch is the evil figure. You know, and then you've got things like Bewitched, where she's not really that evil, it's more comedic. But I can't think, I mean, with Voodoo I can think of several films where it was tried to be authentic, but with Witchcraft I think less so. And I think perhaps I really need, and that's indicative that I've got to really think about, is there an accurate depiction?
That's an interesting one. Thanks for that question. Janet says, many thanks for this fascinating talk. I look forward to purchasing your book when published, and I shall certainly be going to visit Boscastle next year. That's more of a comment there. And another comment here from Anonymous. A question on appearance of poppets. Some are alarming, but no more so than some crucifixion images in Christianity today.
I think the only difference is that yeah, there are some horrific, I've seen some really, really horrific images of crucifixion in churches, in paintings. I think the only difference is that poppets are a tangible object, and you can see the intent to really hurt another individual, and that's the difference with them, really. But yeah, I mean, to just look at, they're quite horrendous.
Yeah. Deborah Curtin says, my only experience with poppets is that I was taught that binding two together offers good wishes and stability to a love relationship. Is this common?
Yeah, and it's not just with dolls. Sometimes poppets are made out of sticks or spoons, or it might be corn. There are lots of things, but yes, that binding together, as I said, it's not all about harm. My work has been more about the cursing, but poppets and dolls and images have been used for positive as well, as they are in Voodoo, with love potions and all sorts.
One from U2397, they said, thank you for a fascinating talk. I will view my family poppet a little differently. He's benign and given to me by a nana with love, but he might have some less friendly cousins.
It's not causing you any harm. It's just something to sit in your home.
And that's the end of the questions. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. There were some great questions tonight. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have anything to add to that, Louise?
No, I've got one more talk scheduled in, which hasn't been advertised yet, but it's at the University Centre Telford on the 10th of August at 6 p.m. So you can look out for that. And that's on zombies and how they evolved from Haiti to Hollywood. So that's the lesson.
Yes.
Thank you all for attending. It's lovely to see so many, well, not physically see you, but I know you're out there. But thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Louise. I just want to say that was just brilliant. And thanks for everyone out there for joining us and sending in great questions. Our next online event will be the 27th of July and is a presentation by students of the University of Wolverhampton on Black Country dialect and humour. This can be booked through Eventbrite. See you all soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.